Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today I'm going to bring you some opinion scholarship, this time on the roots of monotheism. So the idea we're playing around with today is where monotheism came from originally, and whether it's possible that it came from the Indo-European world. So a little bit controversial today, but I don't shy away from that. Before we jump right in, though, I do want to give credit where credit is due. Shout out some of the some of the sources here that I relied on for the inspiration for the show today, but also some of the key details. So I want to mention an episode of the Gnostic Informant YouTube show called "The Truth About Israel," where Neil over at Gnostic Informant interviewed the academic Gad Barnea. Also, an episode of the Myth Vision show on YouTube called "The Roots of Yahweh." I believe it aired back in August in the summer. In that particular episode, it's not an interview with scholars, but it relies on the work of many scholars, including George Mendenhall, Peter Parr, and Ben Rothenberg. I've also pulled in some details from other scholars, particularly Dmitry Ravsky and Christopher Beckwith, which I'll rely on when we get into the Scythian and Zoroastrian information here in just a bit. But beyond that, as you'll see as we go through here, there's references to all sorts of primary sources and firsthand accounts. These are inscriptions from an archeological context. These are holy books, all the things I like to bring to support the argument. And I'm going to call this episode "The Religions of Yahweh and El, the Indo-European Roots of Monotheism." So if that's not clear, we're going to toy around with this idea of where monotheism first arose. And the context here is really going to focus on this strange historical period towards the end of the Bronze Age and maybe up to the 8th and 9th century, when Judaism was forming in the form we know it today. And this strange thing that happens where in the biblical text, we go from looking at God by the name of El, and suddenly this change occurs where God is now called Yahweh. And we're just going to dig into what that means. So without further ado, there's a very old religious idea that's fascinating, but which I've never quite known how to understand. This is the idea of the demiurge. Now, for those of you who are familiar already, you'll know the demiurge is something like God, but not quite the fundamental being. It's the God behind God, so to speak, the architect of creation, but somehow separate and independent from the true God. It's the craftsman, right? That's what demiurge means, is craftsman. He's created by God to do just one thing, to create the cosmos. Now, this idea goes back at least as far as Plato, because he speaks of it in his Timaeus, but comes into its own hundreds of years later when it's taken up by the Neoplatonic philosophers, as well as many early Christian sects. And here we see a kind of logic which insists that God's complete transcendence somehow bars him from direct contact with matter and the immanent world. So he couldn't be their creator. The argument goes, if God can't directly make the world, and yet the world exists, it must have been made by another. And you see how this idea of the demiurge or craftsman falls right into place as the mediator between the fully transcendent God and the fully immanent material world. He is that which lies between matter and spirit and can carry out what a fully transcendent God cannot. Now, you might anticipate a problem here. I mean, how exactly would early Christians adopt such an idea when their theology is so starkly monotheistic? Now, how can there be a demiurge if God is one? And this brings us to an interesting development. As a Christian, you examine the tradition and find a God and a force which stands against him: the devil, Lucifer, Satan. So, if you were searching for candidates that could be the demiurge, Satan rises to the top of the list. Now, Pair this idea with how differently God is characterized in the Old Testament versus how he appears in the New Testament, and you're most of the way there. You see, certain early Christian Gnostic groups saw the fire and brimstone, vengeful God of the Old Testament and simply could not reconcile him with the self-sacrificial, turn-the-other-cheek God of the New Testament. They asked themselves, is it possible these are not the same God? If not, which is God and who the hell is the other guy? Gnostic Christian sects like the Sethians, Ophites, and Valentinians in the first centuries of the Christian era saw the God of the New Testament as the real God, and the God of the Old Testament as a fraud. Not the real God at all, but the demiurge, a poser, and an evil one at that. The demiurge is Satan because he allows the faithful to believe that he is God. He keeps them from the path of righteousness and from worship of the one true God. He blinds them to the reality of any divinity beyond itself. Okay, I tell you this story because I want to explore this idea in earnest. Is the God of the Old Testament really the same as the God of the New Testament? I have reasons for asking this question, which until recently I never did. Now, if you're a regular listener, you'll know I've been speaking a lot lately about two proper names for God that appear in the Bible. The first being El, and the second Yahweh. Now, I've wondered where these names come from, which appeared first, and why the second name appears at all. In my search, I've been quite stunned to find two things. One, an unequivocally polytheistic tradition behind the god El, and two, such a murky and uncertain origin around the god Yahweh. History and archaeology show clearly that El came first as the high god of the Canaanite pantheon, and only much later did the name Yahweh appear. So, who is El? Whenever we encounter El outside of the Bible, he is the leader of a heavenly council of gods. Not one God, but one of many. When we begin to encounter Yahweh, however, something seems to change. Now, granted, we still see Yahweh's name appearing in a polytheistic context, but you would expect this if El was merged with Yahweh, as we're told by modern scholars. What we would not expect is a trend towards monotheism, which was clearly missing, even anathema to the religion of El. But this is what we see. We see the emergence of the name Yahweh at around the very same time we begin to see monotheistic attitudes in the religions of the Mediterranean, including from a tribe of Canaan called the Judeans. So what am I saying? Look, I'm not asserting anything. I'm merely exploring the evidence and asking, is it possible that Yahweh was unrelated to El, a different God entirely? If so, is it possible that the religion of Yahweh is different from the religion of El? That it came from an entirely different origin? Is it possible that the monotheism, which has become characteristic of Judaism and Christianity, came not from the religion of El, but from that of Yahweh? And lastly, and perhaps most controversially, does this mean, as the Gnostics said so many hundreds of years ago, that the God of Christianity is not the God of Israel? I'll begin by stating the very obvious. The name Israel is a theophoric name. It includes the name of the god El, right, as in Israel, which means something like El contends or God contends. Clearly, Judaism and its people, the people of Israel, belong first and foremost to the god El. But when we explore evidence of El worship in history, we find something very different from that depicted in the Old Testament. In the ancient city of Ugarit, for instance, just a few hundred miles from Jerusalem, we find ancient records of the Canaanite religion as it was practiced by the Semitic people of the area in the time before the kingdom of Israel. And these Ugaritic texts date back to the 14th or maybe 13th century BC, so very, very old. And here we find El as the high god ruling over many other deities: Baal, Dagon, Asherah, Shapash, Anat, Yam, and Mot. A few passages from the Ugaritic text will illustrate this polytheism. Just listen to this. The god sat down to eat, the sons of El to drink. El raised his voice and spoke to the assembly of the gods, to Baal, to Dagon, to Asherah, to Shapash, to Kothar Wakasis. You see what I mean? Even if we push forward in time considerably, from the 14th century all the way to the 5th century BC, we find the very same emphasis on a multiplicity of gods. It hasn't gone away. It hasn't changed at all. For instance, in the late 1800s, on the Egyptian Isle of Elephantine in the Upper Nile, a Judean settlement was discovered. This settlement had a temple built to the same design as the Great Temple of Jerusalem. It was occupied by Judeans from the land of Canaan and was, in many respects, an identical society to that in Jerusalem. We even have correspondence between the leadership of Elephantine and the priests of Jerusalem. And this is strange to me when we find in Elephantine evidence of temples and sacrifices, not merely to Yahweh, but also to the divinities Anat, Hashem, and even the Egyptian god Khnum. I guess I would have imagined the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem would act more harshly towards groups of their own people who are off building temples for and worshiping other gods. Could it be that the practice of polytheism wasn't so taboo in this time among the Judeans? Could it have even been accepted or practiced by those in Jerusalem? This would explain their cordial relations with the polytheistic Jews of Elephantine, as well as the evidence we see from Ugarit. Now, wouldn't it? Okay, if we turn now to the Old Testament, we find no shortage of evidence for the deeply seated polytheism of the Israelites. Okay, in the first book of Moses, in the very laws received by God on Sinai, we read in the first of the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." And of course, there's the provocative exclamation by God, "I, thy God, am a jealous God." All right, now, having this appear in perhaps the most formative myth in all of Judaism, it sends a clear message. As if this weren't enough, we see it again when Moses returns from Sinai, only to find his people engaged in polytheism and idolatry, worshiping a golden calf. And I could bolster these examples with others, say in Deuteronomy 6 or Exodus 22, but you get the point. There would be no reason for Moses to forbid the worship of other gods if the Israelites were not doing just that. Now, this, of course, aligns with everything we've seen so far about the religion of El, a polytheistic tribal religion. And then, of course, there's the anomaly of the book of Job. Written perhaps as early as the 7th century BC, this is one of the oldest books of the Old Testament, and therefore captures a view of Judaism in an early form. Now listen to how it presents the so-called monotheistic God of ancient Judaism. Book of Job, the first chapter, it goes like this. "Now there was a day when the sons of El came to present themselves before the Lord." And a few chapters later, "Have you listened in the counsel of God?" Okay, if that doesn't remind you sufficiently of the Ugaritic text, which I'll remind you says, "The God sat down to eat, the sons of El to drink. El raised his voice and spoke to the assembly of the gods." How about another example? This one is from the Psalms and approximately the same age as the book of Job. Okay, Psalm 82 reads like this: El stands in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. Let me say that again. He judges among the gods. Okay, clearly, we see that the Israelites were themselves polytheistic, worshiping a host of gods just as their Canaanite cousins were. But then something unexpected happens. Suddenly and without warning, the book of Exodus introduces a new name for God. In chapter 3, God says, quote, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. Say what? Who is Yahweh? And where in the blue blazes did he come from? There is no trace of this name anywhere in the Canaanite context from which the Jews arose. He is an enigma. All we can say for certain is that Yahweh is not a Canaanite name. So where did it come from? Okay, that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call the scholarly answer. All right, I'm going to give you the accepted scholarly answer, but then I'm going to propose an alluring possible alternative. Okay, modern scholarship shows the earliest known reference to Yahweh from an ancient Egyptian inscription at the Temple of Soleb, built by Pharaoh Amenhotep III in modern-day Sudan. It dated to 1400 BC. It refers to a non-Egyptian nomadic tribe, stating, quote, the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. Okay, next, of similar age, perhaps a bit younger, we have a so-called curse tablet found in the West Bank on Mount Ebla. It reads, quote, you are cursed by the God Yahweh. Cursed. You will surely die. Now, from here, the archaeological record is quite bare, honestly, until we reach the 9th or 8th century BC, where we start to find artifacts like the Moabite Mesha stele from Jordan, the Kuntalet Arjud inscription from Sinai, and various seals, Hebrew seals from Judah. And from these sources, we get phrases like this: Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, Yahweh of Taman, Shema, servant of Yahweh. And then from the Moabites, remember, these were the enemies of the Hebrews here. It says, go take Nebo from Israel. And I took from there the vessels of Yahweh, and I dragged them before Chemosh. Now, this evidence points to the worship of Yahweh among nomadic tribes in the southern Levant and Egypt by the late Bronze Age, but not yet among the Israelites, rather among the Shasu, a related Semitic tribe. Now, stories from the Bible seem to support this origin story, including Exodus 18, where Jethro, a priest of Midian, this is the southern Levant, northern Arabia, this area, teaches Moses and uses the name Yahweh. A couple of examples from Exodus 18. He says, Yahweh had brought Israel out of Egypt, and also blessed by Yahweh. And in other places too, like in Deuteronomy and Judges, Yahweh is associated with the lands to the south of Israel, places like Seir, Taman, Midian, and Edom. So that's a wrap then, right? This explains everything, right? Yahweh emerged among ancient Semites living nomadically in the Egyptian and Arabian deserts and in the Sinai, and moved north, where eventually they encounter the Judeans and merge their god Yahweh with the Canaanite high god El. Right? Maybe not. There are a few pieces of evidence that we have yet to discuss, which put a strain on this theory. Okay, let's see what you make of this. And that brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this one the speculative answer. And this one is way more fun. All right. When archaeologists began digging at Midianite sites from the Bronze Age, they, of course, found all sorts of interesting things, but including fragments of ancient pottery. Okay, the problem is that this pottery was very different from those of the neighboring tribes. indicating a foreign origin. Even the designs painted on the pottery were unusual. They didn't match Levantine style at all, but rather were eerily similar to Mycenaean designs, to early Greek ones. What could this mean? Is it possible that the Midianites came to the Levant from elsewhere, from the Aegean or Western Mediterranean somewhere? And this brings us to another anomaly. While we're talking about Midianite pottery, we have to revisit the Kuntalet Arjud inscriptions. Okay, you remember this is where we find one of the oldest references to Yahweh, which reads, Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. Well, it turns out there's more to this story. Other inscriptions were also found, which reference other gods. And while it's still controversial, many scholars claim that these inscriptions also refer to the gods Indra, Mitra, and Varuna. And if the significance of this isn't clear, allow me to clarify. These are the names of the central gods of the Vedas, one of the very oldest extant religious texts. These were Indo-European gods. Okay, let's do one more. When the scholars review the historical record, they identify so-called theophoric names. These are place names or personal names that include the name of a deity. Think of the Greek name Apollodorus, which embeds the name of the god Apollo. Or for a biblical example, the place name Bethel, which means house of God. Even my own name, Christopher, embeds the name Christ. In other words, being named after a particular god. Now, these theophoric names are very helpful to historians because they reveal which gods were important in various areas and at various times. Now, when we look for theophoric names among the ancient Israelites, we find plenty. Abdiel, Yapael, Elimelech, Israel, Ishmael, Eleazar, Abimael, right? Not to mention the names of biblical angels, Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, etc. But oddly, the search for theophoric names that embed Yahweh are a bit harder to find. That is until much later in Jewish history. Where then do we find the earliest reference to a theophoric name that embeds Yahweh? Wouldn't the answer to that question point us to its origin point? The answer to this question twists the knife in the scholarly consensus. The earliest known theophoric name for Yahweh does not come from the south of Judah, where the scholars suggest it should. In fact, it comes from the far north, from Hittite territory. Dated to the 8th century BC, an inscription from Hamath refers to its governor, a fellow named Yahubidi. Yahu, like Yah and Yahoo, is a form of Yahweh. What is going on here? The Hittites were not Semites. They were an Indo-European tribe who settled in modern-day Turkey. They had an Indo-European language, culture, and religious history. So why in the world would we find the earliest theophoric name of Yahweh there? This is precisely the right question. Now, we began with the proposal that Semitic people from Midian were the origin of Yahweh worship, but then had to face the fact that ancient Midianite pottery has clear connections to the Indo-European people of the Aegean. And now we have the Hittite name Yahubidi, also of Indo-European pedigree. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? The common thread running through Bronze Age Midian and the Hittite Empire is a shared Indo-European origin. Is it possible then that Indo-European people introduced Yahweh to the Levant? How about monotheism? These questions beg others. What was the Indo-European presence in the Levant? What were their religious beliefs? And are there any breadcrumb trails we can follow from there to ancient Judaism? All right, firstly, I think the separation that scholars put between Indo-European cultures and those of the Middle and Near East must have been blurrier than they'd have us believe. I mean, if you just look at the empires of the Bronze and Iron Ages, and you hone in just on the greater Mediterranean and the Middle East, you'll find Indo-European peoples nearly encircling the lands of the Semitic people. The Hittites and Mitanni to the north in Turkey, the Greeks just across the Aegean, the Armenians, not to mention the Medes and Persians to the east. All of these were Indo-European people, which demonstrate their presence and influence in the area. But none of them worshipped a god called Yahweh. Okay, so were there other Indo-European people migrating to the Levant during this period? Indeed, there were. A mysterious and still little understood migration did take place in the Bronze Age, which brought Indo-European people first into Egypt and then beyond. These were the enigmatic Sea Peoples. Our earliest records of the Sea Peoples come from ancient Egypt in the Merneptah stele, dated just a little after 1200 BC, and also the mortuary temple of Ramses III, which is right around the same age. Here we find descriptions of invasions of strange peoples who arrived from the Mediterranean and ravaged the great cities of Egypt, the Levant, and even the Hittites. These tribes are named in the Egyptian record. They're called the Peliset, usually identified with the biblical Philistines. Also the Shurdin, maybe from Sardinia, and the Dinian, probably from Greece, and then the Teresh, likely from Italy. So among others, right? This is not a complete list. And while their exact origins are really unknown, there is no doubt that these people came to the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean from the West, from Indo-European lands. Let's take the Philistines, for instance. Not only do Philistine archaeological sites show, again, a distinctly Indo-European style of pottery, a 2019 genetic study of Philistine burials from 1200 BC revealed genetic markers consistent with, wait for it, Southern European ancestry. Now, is it a coincidence, do you think, that the people of Philistine migration into the Levant, and by extension the Sea Peoples themselves and their migration, is exactly the same period in which scholars believe that El and Yahweh were conflated? Was Yahweh introduced by these strange people from strange lands who arrived from the Mediterranean coast? Well, the Bible seems to think so. When we look at the book of Isaiah, for instance, we see the worship of Yahweh identified over and over again with people from the coast. 24th chapter of Isaiah says, "Give glory to Yahweh in the coastlands of the sea. Give glory to the name of Yahweh." And in the 42nd chapter, they give glory to Yahweh and declare his praise on the coastlands. On the coastlands. That brings me to my next section. I'm going to call this, is monotheism Indo-European? Okay, at this point, I think you can all see where I'm coming from and why I think it's possible that Yahweh was introduced from the Indo-European world. But what about monotheism? Is there evidence that the monotheism characteristic of Judaism was introduced along with Yahweh? Well, how about we use the scientific method, shall we? Let's test this hypothesis. What are the implications of this hypothesis? This gives us a test, that it's something testable we can actually look at. Okay, what would we expect to see if the Indo-European Sea Peoples had brought Yahweh and monotheism to the Levant? So I can think of three things. One, that we'd find evidence of monotheism somewhere in the Sea Peoples' realm of influence. Two, that the name of Yahweh would appear somewhere else in the Indo-European world. And three, we would find some shared mythological or theological elements between the Sea People and Proto-Indo-European tribes elsewhere. Okay, let's start with evidence of monotheism in the Sea People's sphere of influence. When we review the historical record for the earliest evidence of a truly monotheistic religion, we are confronted first by the Aten religion of the Amarna period of ancient Egypt. These were the radical religious reforms of Pharaoh Akhenaten, which speaks of a god rather than the gods. An excerpt from the great hymn to Aten will prove this point. It goes like this: O sole God, like whom there is no other, thou didst create the world according to thy desire, whilst thou wert alone. You hear what I mean? Sole God, no other, alone, monotheism. But we're not talking about Yahweh here. So is this close but no cigar? Not so fast. While it is true that the religion of Akhenaten is distinctly Egyptian, its strict monotheism definitely was not. It very likely came from an outside influence. But from where? From who? Now, scholars are quick to remind us that the Aten monotheism of Akhenaten appears 150 years before the period of the Sea People's invasions. It couldn't, therefore, be the source of that influenced Akhenaten's reforms, right? Akhenaten reigned from 1353 to 1336 BC, but we don't hear about conflict with the Sea Peoples until 1200 BC. Okay, fair enough, scholars. I won't argue with that. But I will point out a few things that should be considered. Okay, first, we remember the Shasu of Yahweh from the Soleb inscription in Egypt. When was that dated from again? Oh, 1400 BC. You mean before the reign of Akhenaten in 1353? Isn't that interesting? Now, while we can't directly link the Shasu to any Indo-European people, we can say, without doubt, that Yahweh worship was present. If, as I hypothesize, Yahwism originates with Indo-European tribes, we must admit that their influence is in the area before Akhenaten. Now, with only this piece of evidence, we might remain skeptical. But there's more. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramses II, dating just before 1300, or just after 1300 BC, and also reliefs that commemorate the Battle of Kadesh, confirm that various tribes of Sea Peoples were already serving as mercenaries in the Pharaoh's army many, many decades before conflict broke out. This point is not controversial. Scholars agree and point to the soldiers in these reliefs that are clearly not Egyptian, and they're depicted with unequivocally European-style armor and weapons. So what does this mean? It means that the Sea Peoples were present in Egypt long before they battled against Pharaoh Merneptah and Ramses III in 1200 BC, and that Yahweh was present earlier still. As we push back the period when Indo-European peoples interact with the Egyptians, we get closer and closer to linking the arrival of Yahweh with the arrival of the Indo-European Sea Peoples. And with the name Yahweh appearing in Egypt in 1400 BC, we have every reason to suggest that the radical monotheistic reforms of Akhenaten, which appear only 50 years later, could have been inspired by the novel monotheistic ideas introduced by the Sea Peoples. Now, I'd be remiss here if I didn't add that scholars have long noted similarities between the great hymn of Aten and Psalm 104. Both hymns describe God using language associated with the sun, and both credit this sole deity with creating all things. That brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call Indo-European Yahweh. All right, let's move to the name Yahweh. If it did in fact come from the Indo-European world, we would expect to see other references or cognates of this name in Europe. Well, do we? The evidence for Yahweh in Europe is admittedly not robust, but it is not absent either. When we examine the earliest record of Greek religion, for instance, we find a cult known as Orphism. Now, Orphism was a so-called mystery religion and surrounded the worship of the god Dionysus. But this was not your granddad's Dionysus. This was something else, something older and deeper. And when we dig into their myths and hymns, we find a very different kind of God than we'd expect from the polytheistic Greeks. We find Dionysus understood in a very unique way and called by a very unique name. Iota, Alpha, Omega. I-A-O, pronounced Yao. We can see this same root too in another ancient name used for Dionysus. You probably know that Dionysus was also called Bacchus, but you might not know that Bacchus was also pronounced Iacchus. Yao, Iacchus. And now for the gut punch. When we examine the Orphic texts, we find Yao described unlike any other deity, described as if it were the one and only deity, as if all other deities were merely expressions of him. Let me read to you a few Orphic hymns that prove this point. There's a hymn called the Hymn to Protagonis, and it goes like this: O mighty first begotten, from whom the race of gods and mortals spring. Right? So one source for the origin of gods and mortals. How about Orphic fragment 239, which reads like this: one Zeus, one Hades, one Helios, one Dionysus, one God in all. And a similar Orphic verse recorded by Macrobius that goes like this: understand that the highest God is Yao, who is Hades in winter, Zeus in spring, Apollo in summer, and gentle Bacchus in autumn. Wow. Okay, I don't know if we can call this orthodox monotheism, but this is monotheism nonetheless. Indo-European monotheism. And if that weren't evidence enough, it's Indo-European monotheism under the name Yao. Yahweh, Yao. Okay, all right. I probably need to pump the brakes here just a little bit. As compelling as this is to me, it must be admitted that the Orphic writings that we just read are of a much later period than the Bronze Age. So we have to take them with a grain of salt. But what if we could bolster this one example with others far older? What if we can demonstrate a pattern of uniquely monotheistic ideas from deep in Indo-European history? Consider this. First, I'll point out, while the Orphic hymn to Protagonis comes from the first few centuries AD, a far cry from the late Bronze Age, we do find the same idea echoed much earlier. In fact, we can go all the way back to the archaic period of ancient Greece in the works of Hesiod, dated to about 700 BC, and there we find the exact same idea. The Orphics suggest that there is a single divine reality from which all the gods come. The Protagonis myth says this god is, quote, from whom the race of gods and mortals spring. Hesiod, similarly, in his book Works and Days, discusses this great mystery, and he says, the gods and mortal men sprang from one source. Do you hear the monotheism in that? One source. From here, we can also point to the pre-Socratic philosophers just a couple hundred years later who insisted that reality depends and arises from a transcendent unity, something that they call the monad. So if we go back to 500 BC, in the words of Pythagoras, he declared that the unbegotten monad was the father of the dyad and the mother of all engendered things, right? The unbegotten monad, that's the first thing. And Plato tells us something very similar 100 years later in the work Alcibiades. He says, all things are the progeny of one fire, one divine nature. The monad is there first and is extended, which generates two. Okay, so The point being made here is that there's one thing there in the beginning from which all other things flow. There's one origin. There's one eternal reality. One. The Orphics and the Presocratics each spoke of a single, all-encompassing divine reality from which all things come, a cosmic unity, a oneness. And I ask you to consider in what way this idea differs from the God of Orthodox monotheism. Does the monotheistic God not fulfill all these descriptions? Even the central tenet of Judaism, the Shema, says precisely this, as we read in Deuteronomy 6. Quote, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It chills up and down my arms. Now, the very earliest Greek creation story, which predates even the Homeric hymns, we don't actually have it in full. It's preserved only in fragments because of its great antiquity. But in it, the Creator God, also described as the one and only divinity. And now this myth we sort of have a reconstructed version of, and it begins like this. In the beginning, Euronome, the goddess of all things, rose from chaos. And then from that point on, she goes to create all things. And it doesn't end here. As we move east across Indo-European territories, we find in the religions of the ancient Scythians and Persians further examples of monotheistic religious ideas. The Scythians, who ruled vast swaths of the area that is today Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan from the 9th century BC, believed that the created cosmos and all of its beings came from one primordial, pre-existent deity they call Tabiti. She was understood as the primordial eternal fire. As an interesting aside, this echoes Plato's Alcibiades, who you remember says, all things are the progeny of one fire. And even prior to Plato, the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who believed that there's a single principle from which all things flow. And he called this principle ever-living fire. Now, the example, or the final example that I want to give, is the most famous of them all. It is the ancient Persian faith known as Zoroastrianism. Now, while the dates involved with it are spurious, potentially as old as 1500 BC, but by the time of the Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BC, it was an influential world religion. Now, Christopher Beckwith, professor of Central Asian Studies at Indiana University, describes the religion of Zoroaster as follows, quote, Zoroaster's innovation in the ancient Near East involved teaching belief in only one God, Ahura Mazda, who created the world. So you see, the thread that runs through all of these Indo-European religions is the notion of a single pre-existing divine unity, a preformation of orthodox monotheism, the very seeds of what will become Judeo-Christianity. And this is fascinating. But there is perhaps an even more fascinating connection between Indo-European religions, which bears a strong resemblance to Christian theology, but which strangely does not exist in Jewish theology. I refer here to the idea that the unity of God is expressed in multiplicity. Now, commonly this is described as a triad, a triune deity, or a trinity, if you like. A famous example from the Indo-European Vedic tradition of India, which is still recognized today, is the Trimurti of Hinduism. The Trimurti is the idea of the ultimate reality, God, which they call Brahma, described as three unique deities: Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. Brahma is one and simultaneously three, or many. But we can push this way, way further back in time. And that brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this Scythian Trinity. Now, we already discussed this divine unity which the Scythian religion believed to be fundamental reality, pre-existent and eternal, the goddess Tabiti. As with all such cases, the divine unity creates all things. The way in which this myth is told, you guessed it, is in the form of a trinity. Tabiti brings forth from herself Father Sky, this is the god Papios, and Mother Earth, the goddess Api. In this way, we have the multiplicity of the created cosmos extending from one source. Creation comes in triune form. The one becomes many, and Tabiti, the primordial living fire, incarnates into heaven and earth. Just like the flame that burns on the altar, the sun that brings life energy to the earth, and the heat of metabolism that we feel in our own bodies, Tabiti runs unbroken through all things. And that brings me to the next section. Similarly, I'm going to call this Zoroastrian Trinity. We see the same pattern echoed in our oldest Vedic texts, right down to their Zoroastrian cousins. In the Vedas, we again encounter a triad of deities which are responsible for maintaining the cosmos. And we've heard these names before. These are Indra, Varuna, and Mitra. In the Vedas, Mitra and Varuna are conflated and called Mitra Varuna. They just hyphenate them and stick them together as if they are one and the same being. And these blurry lines of identity reveal an underlying unity. As we move to Zoroastrianism, this pattern takes the form of Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is the sole divinity and fundamental reality. From him flow all things, arising as dual spirits, Spinta Manu and Angra Manu. They are simultaneously one with Ahura Mazda and also distinct from him. They are one and many. As with the Trimurti of Hinduism, we have a preserving force, Spinta Manu, a destroying force, Angra Manu, and the ultimate reality, Ahura Mazda, which unites them. And that brings me to the next section. This one, you guessed it, I'm going to call this Greek Trinity. In ancient Greece, going back well into ancient Orphism and beyond, there was a strange and mystical conflation between the god Zeus and the god Dionysus, found among no other deities. We saw a hint of this in Orphic Fragment 239. Remember, one Zeus, one Hades, one Helios, one Dionysus, and here's the important bit, one God in all. And the very earliest reference to Dionysus, which survives in the pre-Greek world, right, in the Minoan world, we see Dionysus called Dionyso. Linguistically, this breaks down to Dius Nisa, meaning something like Zeus of Nisa or Zeus of the forest. So we see that the god Dionysus was originally a form of Zeus, identical to him, not a separate god at all. Now, if we turn to the classic Greek myth about Dionysus, we find that Zeus implants the baby Dionysus into his own thigh and incubates inside Zeus's body before being born from Zeus. And I want you to simmer on this image for a minute. Here we have Dionysus equated with Zeus. They are the same god. And yet Dionysus is born from Zeus. He is his own father. The Father and the Son are one. I'm reminded here of John 17, where Jesus prays, quote, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. Now, in both stories, God is simultaneously Father and Son. Are you starting to see it? We have Father Zeus and the youthful son Dionysus, right? That's 2 out of 3. But what about the third spoke of this Trinity? Okay, I do have to reach a little farther on this one. But hear me out. Dionysus was known as the god of frenzy and intoxication, especially the sort that comes from wine. But when we follow that thread backwards in time, we find the meaning here to be something quite different. The intoxication felt under the influence of wine was seen as the spirit in the wine, in the grape, in nature itself. Dionysus in this way is understood as the spirit of life and animation, the force within nature that lives within it, that pushes growth and flowering and fruiting. It is the creative, generative force within you that lives and moves and grows. It is this force, this spirit, which constitutes the final piece of the Greek Trinity. Father Zeus, Dionysus the sun, and the spirit of life itself, the sacred spirit. And that brings me to my conclusion. I'm going to call the conclusion, is the God of Christianity the God of Israel? So let's revisit this question we began with. So what have we learned? That Judaism originates from ancient Canaanite polytheism, centering on the worship of El and having no propensity towards monotheism whatsoever. That the religion of Yahweh seems to have been introduced to the Levant, likely from Indo-European tribes at the end of the Bronze Age, and that the monotheism entered the Semitic consciousness from the same foreign influences. All the evidence supports this, from the earliest theophoric name embedding Yahweh coming from the Indo-European Hittites, to the pottery of the Sea Peoples of Indo-European style, which refer to Yahweh, along with potentially the names of other Indo-European gods. With that said, how can we say that the religion of El was the same as the religion of Yahweh? We can't. At this early period, when El and Yahweh first came into contact, they were entirely distinct faiths and even at odds with one another. Now the question becomes, was the development of Christianity out of first century Judaism an extension of the traditions which stem from the religion of El, or from the religion of Yahweh? Now this isn't an easy egg to crack. I'll be the first to admit that by the time of Jesus, these two traditions were sufficiently intertwined that they couldn't be pulled apart. Surely Christianity is the consequence of both traditions in some measure. However, there are a few things we must consider. First, there is the disdain that Jesus himself shows openly towards the priests of Jerusalem for their overbearing literalism and emphasis on the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. And then there's the theological developments which arose uniquely in Christianity and not in Judaism. The most powerful example being the nature of God as both one and many, as a trinity. Where the ancient Scythians saw the primordial creator filling and incarnating all things with life and animating fire, the Greeks recognized the same spirit in Dionysus. This idea appears in full force in Christianity as the Holy Spirit, which immediately incarnates in the world upon creation. Genesis shows this spirit as pre-existent. Quote, in the beginning, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And the Gospel of John shows the same spirit in Trinitarian form. Quote, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And just like the Dionysian and Scythian spirit, John confirms it is the spirit of life itself. Quote, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. Okay, we see none of this theology in Judaism. None of it. But we see it in Christianity as well as in many other Indo-European religions of antiquity. So clearly, there is a tradition which Christian theology is continuing, that Jewish theology is not. This is odd and difficult to reconcile if Christianity is nothing more than an outgrowth of Judaism. But I detect different traditions here, and so, seemingly, did Jesus. So again, I'll ask, is the God of Christianity the same as the God of Judaism? What do you think? Is the religion of El the same as the religion of Yahweh? And what does it mean that we've blurred the lines between them? And I suppose that's for you to decide.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.